Evet, tekrar merhabalar. Hoş geldiniz hepiniz. Yavaş yavaş başlayalım. Gelmeye devam edenler olacaktır tahmin ediyorum deyip İngilizceye dönüyorum. Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today in our webinar. This is the first session of our webinars targeting to better understand our global markets, and we are going to start with MENA region. We'll continue this series with different regions and countries during this year and next year, I hope. Today, Mohammed Minawi'nin will be presenting. He's from Ipsos in MENA, Chief Commercial Officer in there. And he will be sharing his thoughts, experiences with us about most followed trends and in MENA region as the expert of the region. You can ask directly your questions to him following the presentation. The presentation will take 40-45 minutes, I guess, and our webinar length is all over 1 hour. So I'm giving the word to Mohammed, and big thanks for being with us, Mohammed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yasemin, and good night, everyone. I'm very happy to be speaking to this audience today. As Yasemin mentioned, today's presentation is about the mega trend shaping the Middle East and North Africa region. When we talk about mega trends, we're not talking about things that are going to happen today or tomorrow or maybe within the next year. We're looking a bit further ahead, things that have happened in the last maybe 10 or 20 years or are going to happen within the next few decades as well. The reason why we're focusing on mega trends in our region is because the Middle East is actually one of the fastest changing regions globally. In fact, the second fastest changing region after sub-Saharan Africa. And that's why, and a lot of these changes are happening under the radar. A lot of our clients, policymakers, businesses aren't necessarily aware of them. So I'll be talking to you about 5 that we've identified that I think any business decision making interested in the region should be looking at. But first, I'm aware that some of you might not be aware of how we look at our region. So just one quick slide on what we talk about when we talk about MENA. Really, we look at it in terms of 3 sub-regions. Sometimes we look at Egypt separately, but generally 3 sub-regions. You have the oil-rich Arabian Gulf that has some of the Arab world's wealthiest and largest economies. Then you have the Levant, which is closer to Turkey, very urban, very educated, but struggling economically as a result of the instability over there. And then you have the less urban, more rural North Africa, which is one more populous part, maybe poorer a little bit, but definitely more populous part. That's where the numbers are, with Egypt, of course, being roughly 1 in every 5 people in our region. So that's just how we look at the region. However, the trends I'm going to talk to you about, they might be at different stages of development, but they really apply across the board. So what are the 5 trends that we're going to talk about today? The first is that we are a rapidly maturing region. Like I said, we are changing. And specifically, when I talk about maturity, I'm talking about demographic maturity, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The second is about gender equality becoming a necessity. We don't necessarily believe in gender equality, unfortunately, as a region, but it is becoming a necessity. So we're kind of going through the same motions as other regions around the world went through. Now is our time. The third is about how the economy is shaping consumer choices. And I'll also mention the details of the last decade has been difficult in the Middle East and North Africa region and what that's done to how people spend their money and how they think about money. Fourth is the myth about health that a lot of people in our region talking about. We are thinking healthy, but we don't live healthy. That's why we call this healthy living, healthy thinking, unhealthy living. And finally, of course, we cannot talk about mega trends without talking about digitization. So I'll also talk about some key trends over there. So first, let's start with trend number 1, a rapidly maturing region. As you probably know, the Middle East North Africa region is actually one of the fastest growing regions in terms of population. So we started the decade at just below 350 million. We're going to double in size by 2050 from the start of the century. By that time, the Middle East or the MENA region will actually have a larger population than Europe, because in Europe, the population is actually declining. But what's more important than the growth of the population is the profile. So what we looked like at the start of the century, demographically, will be very different than what we will look like in 2050. And one of the key reasons behind that change is this figure here, which is urbanization. This is the region that is very rapidly urbanizing. So at the start of the century, 6 in 10 people lived in urban areas. By 2050, it's going to be 3 in every 4 living in urban areas. Today, around 2/3 live in urban areas, and that's going to increase by 10 percentage points. And when we look at what that means in terms of numbers living in urban areas, we're talking about 150 million more people living in urban areas over the next 3 decades, 2 and a bit decades. So that's going to create many more megacities. So today, Cairo is a megacity. We expect Baghdad to be the next one to hit the 10 million mark, Khartoum, maybe Riyadh as well. So you're going to have different economic centers. I know people sometimes look at urbanization with a negative light, but the truth is a more urban region means the net positive effect is that the quality of life will improve, our access to healthcare, to education, to digital infrastructure. It's also easier for businesses. So the more we urbanize, the easier it becomes for businesses to operate in this region. And that's where we're trending. However, as a result of urbanization, what many people don't realize is what's happening to our fertility rates, the number of children on average that every woman bears. So we actually used to be a much larger we had a much higher number of kids and a much larger family size. Our baby boom years in our region was actually the mid-70s to the mid-80s. That's when we produced a lot more babies that actually survived. So we hit a peak in the 80s and the 90s. We had on average almost 5 children per household. Today we're at 2.7. So that's almost half of what we were 3 decades ago. And we're shifting by 2050 to reach close to the replacement rate. That's the rate below which a population starts to decline. By the way, I think Turkey is on that or slightly below. We're heading towards that direction. So there are interesting implications here from a business perspective, because a lot of businesses that come to our region still assume that there's this, large Arab family that is sitting together and, 6, 7 people. That's not true anymore. We're talking about 4.7 people actually now, 2 parents and 2.7 children, and that will continue to decrease. So even when we talk about what we're offering these people, we can no longer and should no longer think about this as a large nuclear Arab family. Actually, that also has implications on our offering because we're declining. As a result of declining fertility rates, of course, naturally what's tend to happening is while we are still a young region, we are starting to get older. This is also a trend that I think many of the businesses, even in our region, don't realize. So in 1990, when we talk about the percentage of people below 30, that was 70%. A lot of people still talk about this region having 70% youth. That's not true anymore. Our youth, or the people below 30, are actually 55%, almost half. Sometime between 2020 and 2050, probably around 2030 or 2035, we will have parity between youth and non-youth. And then irreversibly, by 2050, we will be a region that is predominantly above 30. And as you can see from our median age here, between 1990 and 2050, our median age is going to go up by 13 years. So I know everyone's fixated on youth and everyone's talking about the younger generations in our region. As I'll show you later, the wealth and the money is with the aging and increasingly a sizable segment of the older generation. In fact, when we look at who is the fastest growing segment in our region, it's definitely the senior citizens. Today, 1 in 18 people on average in MENA is above the age of 65. Over the next 2.5 decades, that number will go down or go up to 1 in every 7 people will be above the age of 65. In many places in the region already, we're hitting 1 in 5 people are above the age of 65. In fact, roughly in MENA, 1 in 4 people is above the age of 40 today versus how we were a few decades ago. And again, this is where a lot of the wealth is concentrated. It's not with the younger generations, and I'll show you that a bit later in the presentation. But we need to start thinking about, if you want to target a wealthier generation, we need to start talking about Generation X, which is the wealthiest generation today in MENA and actually in the region's history, versus maybe the millennials or the Gen Z. Of course, it depends on your category, but we cannot ignore the aging segment that's a very important part of the future growth and future opportunities. But also how we talk to these people. This aging generation in MENA is not like my dad's generation. So when I'm at my dad's age, I will be much more ageless, much more adaptable. I'll probably have more money. I want to live life to the fullest. We're going to be much more casual, and we're already starting to see that in the Gen X and also the bridge or older millennials. So we also, when you're talking about MENA, part of the opportunity is we also need to start thinking about the perennial generation, because you know the borders between generations are getting fuzzier, particularly when we talk about millennials and Gen Xers. So we really need to start thinking about this as well. And again, this is where the wealth is, and we need to speak to these people differently. Within all this trend, what's also changing is not only demographics, but also our attitudes and our lifestyles. Obviously, and I see a lot of brands make this mistake when they want to communicate. They talk about, again, a large Arab family sitting and having lunch together. And that doesn't happen anymore. It's, you know, similar, think about the cities in Turkey and how fast-moving life is. A lot less people are spending time as family, whether you're employed or not, but that, you know, valuable family time doesn't exist anymore. There's a lot more on the go. So we also need to understand that there's an opportunity there when we talk about targeting consumers. And interestingly, how we also speak to the people of the region because of how they view themselves. So today, 1 in 2 people view themselves as global citizens. So if you want to talk to them as Arabs, you're probably missing half there because they identify more globally, particularly younger generations. And we expect this number to go up. And also 1 in 2 people don't necessarily share the same values as their parents. So also the younger generations are definitely more global. They're definitely more open. So also when we talk to these people or we think about what kind of products or messages we want to deliver to these people, we also need to realize that we need to speak differently to the young Middle Eastern than we do to the older Middle Eastern, including as they age, by the way, they will continue to take those values with them. So that's the first trend, major demographic changes that will definitely have major implications on how we talk to people, what we offer people. The second one, also very interesting, is about gender equality. So if we look at our region, and this is not a slide that I'm ever proud presenting to an audience, but the truth is we rank worse when it comes to closing the gender gap. We actually have a serious issue when it comes to gender equality as a region. And in fact, 7 out of the 10 worst performing countries are actually in MENA. That also includes Iran, by the way, but the rest of my presentation doesn't. The main reason behind that is that we have the lowest female labor force participation levels in the world. In fact, even in sub-Saharan Africa, because it's more rural, there are more women working in sub-Saharan Africa as a percentage than we have in MENA. This is a serious issue that we have. What that really means, though, from a business perspective, is that most women, when they don't make their own money, they are financially dependent, and then the way they spend it is very limited. So in addition to this being maybe a human story, there's also an economic story, and that's really where the change will come from. So most women actually depend on allowance as a primary source of income. 1 in 10 women in our region actually do not generate an income. And we've done a lot of work on this region to see that women who are dependent and generate their own income obviously spend more. They spend more on themselves. When women are depending on a primary allowance, it's typically mothers that end up really just spending, you know, their husband's money on the children. So they're not necessarily contributing to many parts of the economy and really just focusing on the kids. But there's a big gap. Once women become independent and earn their own income, we see good economic growth as a result of that. Of course, the main reason why we're starting to see some change and why we say this will become a necessity, even if our attitudes might not agree with it, is because there are massive economic costs for the exclusion of women in our region. It's close to 600 billion, which is, if we think of that as an economy annually, that's a really big figure. That's almost as large as the Arab world's largest economy, actually. So when we talk about 575 billion as a whole, that is a gap that we remove out of the GDP every year, or that we can potentially add onto our GDP. This is the reason why things, we think, will be changing over the next decade. And if you see some of the initiatives that are happening in places like Saudi Arabia, which is historically very conservative when it comes to women, places in Egypt where women are quite oppressed and there are, relatively high harassment levels. The reason why the governments there are making change is not necessarily because the men ruling those countries would like to improve the status of women. It's because of this figure right there. So it's good business. In addition to the human story, it's actually good business to get women to be involved in the economy. And a lot of our governments are now starting to realize that and are starting to push in that direction. But the reason why we have an issue, again, not a slide I'm proud presenting, but this is the fact today. The historical issue with women is that our attitudes aren't pro-equality. In fact, only 2 in every 5 people in our region believe in gender equality, including surprisingly 1 in 5 women. Of course, this number is going up, so it's improving. Of course, amongst younger generations, things are much more positive. We hit the 55% over there. But generally, this is what's holding us back, and this is what it looks like today. But what's changing is the situation of women in our region. So the stars are aligning, and there's a good moment that's kind of happening for women today that will allow them to get out of where they are today. First of all, you might not know this. I know people talk about, Arab women being oppressed. The truth is, within the Arab household, the women are key decision makers. They're actually very strong, our women. They might, maybe the laws, the public, they might appear to be weak, but anyone that's done any work on females as consumers knows that actually, on many cases, they have the final say within the house. So you start from a place where our women aren't weak. I think it's we limit them by law, but they're actually not weak. Also importantly, is much more women are getting a secondary education, a university degree than was the case a few years ago or a few decades ago. So in the 2000s, 1 in every 5 women got a university degree. Today we see roughly 1 in 5 women are working. In 2020, that's more than doubled to 43% and continues to do so. We expect, as a result, a lot more women in the workforce and thus contributing economically. On a MENA level, 1 in 2 women in universities are actually women. So you're more likely to get a degree as a woman than a man now in the MENA region. And what's also important, and this is the important change that's happening, is that despite the region not necessarily believing in equality, the men in the region, a lot of them now, think that despite that, women need to start expanding their role beyond the household, i.e. they need to get income, they need to be supporting the household, they need to support me as a man. So that number has almost doubled over the last decade. So from the 2010, 2011 era, again, we went through a rough decade as a region. That number is actually almost doubled. So previously, only 1 in 3, or maybe roughly below half, actually believed that women, should work and should contribute. Today, it's actually 7 in 10 people, the majority, including amongst males. So we expect as a need for this to happen. Just to give you an example, for those of you who are kind of aware of the female empowerment movement in Asia, we're going through a similar trend, maybe 2 decades later than them. So economic pressure supported by readier, better educated women at a time where law is, the policymakers are realizing that there's a good benefit from empowering women. That's what's really working in the favor of women today, and allowing them to actually get into the labor force and become more dependent. What this means, and this is the important bit, and why this trend is important, is that, of course, like we said, if you are a woman that's not working today, you're essentially a cost on the man that's the breadwinner of the family. If you're working, you're adding value. Okay, so you're adding actually financial and monetary value to the household. So what it does is it increases the value of the household, as do lower fertility rates, by the way. It also increases individual spending. So women that today might be, we tend to look at them, and a lot of businesses tend to look at them as just simply, decision makers within the house for household products. They start spending much more on products that are not necessarily only for the family. And of course, that leads everywhere. I mean, around the world, where more women started working, that led to economic growth and economic diversification. So as important as our clients look at women today as a segment, we think they're completely undervalued. And over the next decade, they're going to be extremely important individually and collectively in terms of the value they will add to their households. My third trend kind of segues from the economic story of women, is about the economy and how that's shaping consumer choices. And I'm well aware of the current economic situation in Turkey. We've had a really bad situation for a bit longer than that. In fact, we had a really bad decade, I'd say, economically. But what's interesting is to see how that shaped certain segments of society that I'm sure are a top priority for many of you, such as millennials. So one thing that hasn't changed over the last 10 years is this figure. 2 in 3 people will always see some part of the economy or an economic concern as a primary concern in their country, whether it's high cost of living, unemployment, poverty, a weak economy generally. But this has been a primary concern for the majority for a very long time now. And the reason why it's a problem and where it kind of limits our economic growth in some places is because people are seeing these increases on necessities rather than luxuries. So we're always consumed as consumers with where we're going to spend our money on things like food and utilities and transport, let alone things like big ticket purchases such as electronics or travel or fashion and luxury, etc. So there is an economic concern. And a lot of people ask, why is this a mega trend? I mean, this is just a specific time period. When we think about the psychology of money, when something happens for a very long time, when people are struggling for a very long time, they form certain habits that are difficult to reverse. And I'll talk later about specifically the millennial generation in MENA, which a lot of people are focusing on. The millennial generation, which started working and started making income in the last decade, really, for a large part of them, in the last 15 years, have grown up in financial difficulty, and that's shaped how they actually behave and consume. One of the biggest issues, of course, that we have in the region, and ask any policymaker in the Arab world, and they'll tell you this is probably their biggest headache, is that we do have our employment levels are actually double the global average. And here I'm going to tie this back to why I think aging segments are maybe more interesting from a business perspective than the younger generations. We have, as a region, we have 5 million new people joining the workforce every year. Add that to our high unemployment levels. We need to create 10 million jobs every year to close this gap. We're barely creating half of that. So really what ends up happening, and if your target is young people in this part of the region, is it affects the younger people. So in fact, we have the highest youth employment levels anywhere in the world. And this is a serious problem. And for a lot of you that might be talking to the younger generations in the Middle East region, of course, the numbers are there. They are a sizable segment, but you need to understand that these people don't necessarily have money. A lot of them aren't necessarily working, and those that do work don't necessarily have a lot of money. But that's an opportunity, and I'll talk about that later. That's an opportunity for a strong mid or value brand, Turkish brands, because there is a demand for something that is not necessarily, well known internationally and expensive. Turkish brands are actually viewed positively by the younger generation, and also viewed to have good value for money. So there is an opportunity for youth over there. But if you're a luxury brand targeting youth, you're probably going to have some difficulty, and it might actually make more sense to focus on the older generations. So the result of that is that we have 3 in 10 people are in debt. Only 15% are actually able to save money on a monthly basis. So people don't necessarily plan financially very well. But when we look at it by generation, and this is also important, millennials are twice more likely to be in debt than baby boomers. In fact, in our region, the millennial generation, which, by the way, is no longer very young. I mean, the upper age of millennials today is 42, right? So when we talk about youth, really, we're talking about Gen Z now. But millennials, particularly those that get married, are the most indebted generation in our region's history. Whereas the wealthiest generation in our region's history is actually generation right above it, Generation X, which is actually a forgotten generation in many parts of the world. So if you're looking at millennials, we don't expect necessarily Gen Z to perform much better if the economy continues the way it is. But you just, again, these are sizable. There are 100 million millennials in MENA, so that's a big figure. But you just need to understand that this is their situation. So luxury is not necessarily what they're looking for. In fact, what we're seeing is how purchase decisions are changing as a result. We do see that people are much more calculated and much more price conscious, partly, of course, because of the economy, partly because also of the growth of e-commerce and all of the prices are online. But we're seeing that many more people know the price of everything that they're buying. We also see that almost half today we actually consider deal seekers. That's up from around a third maybe a decade ago. So more and more people in this part of the world, particularly young people, are actually looking for better deals all the time. But again, that's where I say there's an opportunity for Turkish brands here to really compete with the global brands in our region. This is also very interesting. Of course, as we know, there's a direct relation between price sensitivity and brand exploration. So our younger generations, brand loyalty is actually not as high. They are open to exploring options, particularly if those options make financial sense. And again, we think there's an opportunity here for brands coming from Turkey. By the way, we already see growth of Turkish brands in places like the Levant. We see that also in North Africa, particularly viewed positively, viewed as good value for money. That's what people are looking for. One of the other changes we see is that people are looking for more economic options. 1 in 2 people today will actually buy a store brand, and that number is actually significantly increased. And we're also starting to see that in high sensitivity categories. I mean, we've been seeing store brands in places like, paper, in the paper business, things like, toilet paper, facial tissues, etc. We're now starting to see that in food as well. Okay, so this is also a validation of that people don't really care about these global brands anymore. In fact, we know today that the majority prefer local products, but alongside these, they also prefer, there's also an affinity towards Turkish brands, by the way, some Asian brands as well, China and elsewhere. So while we talk to the local businesses of this being an opportunity for our local businesses to actually make use of the difficult economic times, I think this is a massive opportunity also for mid and value brands in Turkey, providing good quality for a lower price than maybe European or Western brands. So there is an opportunity there. My fourth trend is about health, and like I said, there's a big myth around health in our region, and I think around the world. But I'll talk about our region. So we call this healthy thinking and unhealthy living. I think what everyone agrees on is there's going to be a lot more money in healthcare in this region, and a lot of opportunities, but also a lot of legislation. So as a region, we believe that we are in good health. Most people, 8 in 10 people, will say, yeah, I think my health is just fine. I have no problems. When we talk about life priorities, actually health, 1 in 2 people would consider having good health a top priority, and that's up. And that's why we're saying mentally people are actually thinking about health. So that used to be number 3 or 4. Number 1 is always making money. Number 2 used to be, having a family and living a good family life. So now health is actually number 2. So mentally, it appears to be like this is, something that's of importance. But the truth is, even though they're prioritizing health, most consumers actually have a very low health awareness and aren't really living a healthy lifestyle. So when we talk about something as simple as food, we have that for many other things, such as also physical activity, mental health. Our numbers are not good. But when we talk about something as basic as eating healthy, we see that actually the majority do not have eating healthy habits on a weekly basis. And as you can see, to dispel a myth over here, the younger generations are nowhere near as healthy or as health conscious as the older generations. And that's because there's a myth and a misconception that the younger generations in our region are leading this, new drive towards health. That's not true, by the way. It hasn't been true for decades. And it's also not the case in most other parts of the world. So we have in some of our offices around the world, we've been tracking this figure by age for maybe 30 or 40 years. the younger people are always the ones that are not practicing healthy lifestyles. It's once we get older, once we start to age, once we start feeling something, maybe do a blood test, the doctor tells us we need to take care of something, that's when we become healthier. Everywhere around the world, no exception. MENA, Japan, UK, Brazil, US, Canada, it's always the same trend. So for those of you who are maybe in food or in healthcare, the real money in health, in the health trend, is actually in the aging older population. And that's also why we say there will be more money in healthcare, because we will have a much larger number of older people who will become more health conscious, who will go for diet options, who will be spending more on healthcare. So just to dispel that myth. So we are not a healthy region. We don't necessarily have a good health awareness. 2 in 3 people don't really read nutritional labels. Over half will not really go out of their way to get a healthier product necessarily. The result of that is that we actually have a rising health problem. So when a lot of our, let's say, food clients talk to us about, but there is a health trend, we tell them, the healthcare numbers don't lie. Our healthcare numbers are actually trending negatively. We do have 1 in 2 people are overweight and obese. As you know, in the GCC, we have serious child obesity problems. That's why there's a lot of legislation now that's starting to take shape in these places. And people aren't aware of that issue. That's why policymakers will probably drive change more before the people drive it themselves. A lot of people actually underestimate their weight category. So they're obese, but they think they're just slightly overweight, or they're overweight, but they think they're fine. We also have actually the highest diabetes prevalence levels in the world. It's not North America. North America is 11.9. In our region, it's actually 12.2, expected by the end of the decade to reach 14.5. So we do have definitely issues in health. It means there will be a lot more money in this industry, but there will be also a lot more legislation, because policymakers in our region are already starting to feel the heat, so to speak. As you probably know, some of you in food might know already that, in the UAE, for example, they're putting this traffic light system on food now. In Saudi Arabia, it's a big part of their Vision 2030, and you need to show calories everywhere. So we're starting to see a lot of that, because policymakers are starting to realize this is a very expensive trend, and we cannot have so many young people living unhealthy lives so early on, because their numbers will continue to add up on our system. In terms of expectations of people, actually people are more likely to expect businesses to need to address health issues than the government. The expectation is generally, if you're a food brand, you need to do something right. Tobacco needs to kind of do their bit, etc., less than the government. But the reality is, it's the governments that are starting to, and again, everywhere around the world, our region is no different. It's usually the government that starts with legislation, and the businesses kind of follow on that. Like I was saying, already some governments are starting to take action. A lot of action in Saudi Arabia, a lot of action in the UAE, Kuwait more recently, but we expect that trend to also start in the Levant and in North Africa eventually, because there are also high obesity levels over there. My final trend is on digitization. And like I said, we can't talk about trends without talking about digitization. But what I really want to focus on here is not the buzz of digitization, but what I really want to inform everyone is that this will have disruptive change, and it's real, and we all need to be ready for it. For starters, for people who might not know, 83% of our region are connected to the internet. A lot of people outside our region find this shockingly high. We're actually very digital. We are a very highly connected region in comparison to kind of maybe our prosperity levels. So we are definitely much higher than sub-Saharan Africa. In the GCC, by the way, particularly in the Arabian Gulf, it's actually some of the highest, most connected regions globally. So don't underestimate the impact of digital on our region. And when we talk about digitization, we're really talking about digitization that's happening across the board. So online shopping's on the rise, digital mobility, connected health, non-traditional finance, people who are willing to bank beyond banks, so many other things. And again, by region, this differs. So if we talk about the Arabian Gulf, online shopping is double that. It's almost 75%. Digital mobility is also double that. So there is a geographic distribution here The Arabian Gulf is the highest, Levant is followed by that, and then it's North Africa. But regardless, the trend is the same. We are digitizing at a very rapid pace. What that's doing is it's actually, to a large part, also changing how people choose to socialize. So the majority of the people in our region, I mean, similar to pretty much everywhere, are on social media. 1 in 3 people, in fact, prefer socializing or spend more time socializing face-to-face, digitally, online with their friends, as opposed to face-to-face. This used to be 1 in 10, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And this is before the metaverse, by the way, and before but we are spending a lot more of our lives virtually as a region. Also importantly is how people are consuming content. So a few years ago, we used to talk about, this many people consuming content. Today, we're talking about 1 in 2 people actually paying for digital content, and particularly the younger generations, whether it's, streaming, whether it's in-app purchases. So there's a lot more, or Netflix or whatever, there's a lot more of the share of wallet going on to digital. And when we talk about the younger generations, as I mentioned earlier, they're more likely to be in debt. They're less likely to have money. But even with that, a larger share of their wallet is actually being spent on digital content. Also, the way people prefer to interact with brands and companies and businesses is changing. More and more of us would rather interact digitally than face-to-face. And, the implications here, of course, is definitely much cheaper for businesses to interact this way, and much easier from a consumer perspective. And when you can see this by region again, where in the Arabian Gulf and the GCC region, where the infrastructure is actually more prepared for that, and businesses are already more likely to do that, we see much higher preference there. So this is just a matter of time before the majority, and in some sectors already we know the majority actually prefer digital interaction. From a brand perspective, when you want to talk to people in the region, we're seeing brand engagement levels are actually on an unprecedented level, because so many people are connected, particularly younger generations. You're now able to interact with brands, with consumers directly. So people are actually very engaged with brands online in our region, whether it's, liking or posting or interacting or regularly checking, following a brand page. So really direct truth. That's a great, easy, cost-efficient way to reach people and engage them and kind of get them to follow you directly, because people are very open to that. And what we also see is the idea of a consumer as authority on brands, whether positive or negative. And we'll talk about influencers in a bit. Previously, maybe 10 years ago, we used to see a lot more negativity online towards companies and businesses. Today, honestly, it's just more genuine conversation. If I've had a positive experience, I will talk about it. If I've had a negative experience, I'm equally likely to talk about it. So there no longer is a negative bias necessarily, because social media is no longer a new thing. People really spend a lot of the times on it. So that's something that's important to also note out. Having advocates, that's also important. But in terms of decision making and influencing decisions, and we get asked this question a lot, people are much less likely to make a final call based on social media influencers than based on recommendations of other people. Everywhere today, if you go on an e-commerce site, you can see the ratings of other people. Go on Google Maps or search, you'll see the ratings of other people. That's the moment of truth. But where influencers are important is, of course, in raising salience and raising awareness, but not necessarily at the moment of truth making the right decision. So how you rate online is actually very important, genuinely, by other consumers. Also, how do people get their information? Definitely more online. So you want to talk to people, that's probably the best way to reach people in our region. But again, particularly the younger generations, not the baby boomers. And finally, we see a lot more people spending a lot more of their money online and are shopping more frequently. But also interesting to know what that's doing to consumers. For starters, hybrid shopping, definitely omni-channel exists, but a bigger part of our journey is actually online today. A bigger part of our search journey is online. So that's really how you want to try and get shoppers as they make their decisions. Another thing to understand of how online shopping is changing us is we are becoming much more planned. So think about someone that goes on a shopping on a retailer's website. A lot of the categories are already there. We tend to know what brands we want to buy. We tend to know what categories you want to buy. So you really need to break that path more strongly once people start shopping online, in our region at least. And online is making us more price sensitive because prices are everywhere. So our consumers are now much more likely to compare prices. 4 in 5 online shoppers actually go online and shop online because it's cheaper to do that. And that's kind of building our psyche accordingly. We're also starting to spend more online. Sorry, this is my final slide. We are starting to spend more online. So 3 years ago, before the pandemic, spending more in store was 73%. Today, spending more online is actually 42%. So we're seeing a big shift. Once you start shopping online, you really start spending more of your money online. So you need to be within these channels. You need to be engaging digitally with consumers. So finally, just a quick wrap up, the 5 trends. We are rapidly maturing, as I said. We're aging, we're more global, our lifestyles are more urban, our family sizes are declining. Gender equality, while we don't believe in gender equality, women are much more ready, much more empowered, and that will have economic growth, and they will become more important as a segment. The consistency of economic pressure has created more calculated shoppers, more increased price sensitivity, less loyalty, and there's a big opportunity for brands such as Turkish brands to come in and play in this space. Health, like I said, there's low familiarity. It is a bit mythical, but we expect more legislation and more money to happen here. And then finally, we definitely are more connected, more vocal, and more virtual as a region. And that will be my presentation.
Yes, great. Thank you, Mohammed. It was a long round and it was really good wrap up. Thank you very much. So anybody having the questions, you can raise your hand and I can give you the micro, by the way. But I have my own questions, Mohammed, for you. As far as I understood, we are more or less in the same path in terms of economical situation and consumer choices, and also in digitization part of the business. In terms of economics, I would like to ask that how is the positioning of Turkish brands in your market? Because you said that there's an opportunity for Turkish brands over there towards globals, but what do you think about the Turkish brand positioning over there?
Okay, so we actually have a very clear idea because we've done quite a bit of work, and a lot of our clients look at Turkish brands as potential competitors. Like I said, as a result of the economic pressure, Turkish brands are on the rise, as are Chinese, by the way, and others. So when you're competing, you're not necessarily only competing with local brands. The perception towards Turkish is positive. So made in Turkey generally has positive perceptions, particularly if it's a known brand. So we do have a lot of kind of unknown brands that are Turkish as well that kind of come out. But really, when we talk about the big Turkish brands that are known in your market and that export to our markets, I'd say it's positive, and that's why I say it's a perception. It's perceived to be good quality, but at an affordable price. And I think similar to how Turkish brands kind of are positioned in the European market, in our market it's the same. It's a good quality, but a lower price brand. Not a cheap brand, perception-wise, but a good value brand.
Okay. It may differ most probably from industry to another. I mean that for CPG is a different story, perhaps, but for durables is a different story. What do you think about that perspective? You can say that CPG is an opportunity, or the other kind of industries.
So electronics is already doing well. I think on they're already quite active. I think Turkish brands. I think definitely there's an opportunity in food. That's a positive perception. In some places, maybe in North Africa, automotive at some point might be a thing.
Okay.
But I'd say that definitely CPG, electronics is, at least today, and fashion, by the way. There's a growing trend towards Turkish fashion as well.
Yeah, fashion is important, as far as I know from our clients as well. They're investing a lot in MENA region. They're having some retail points, shops, etc. over there. So in relation with that, and also in relation with health trend. So I would like to. It's a micro question, by the way, but my curiosity, let's say, what do you think about the active wear style? Okay, because in the pandemics we have seen here this is rising up, and the fashion perception is changing. all over the world and also in Turkey, and the brands are getting bigger and bigger in terms of activewear. And what do you think about your markets? Because it's a bit different, I guess.
Actually, we've had the same trend where kind of people spending on fashion, forget that it declined a bit in the pandemic, but it's picking up again. It definitely moved into more casual, active wear and more casual as opposed to maybe more formal. So it is a trend, but like you say, it's not, a lot of things after the pandemic honestly came back to the normal part for us. So yes, people are still a bit more casual, but not stay-at-home wear anymore.
Okay.
That's kind of peaked and then declined after.
And my last question will come from digitization trend. Digitization is important for all markets, for all marketing strategies. We know this very well, and you are really well digitized in terms of connection, number of connected people. So, what do you think about, for example, the communication strategy when a brand is entering to the market? So the best way to spend their money perhaps would be via digital, or still they should keep the traditional rhythm, traditional route to reach the people.
In our markets, and we monitor media in this region as Ipsos, so we kind of know where the spending is going. From a few years ago, already people spend more digitally. Brands are already spending more digitally than traditionally. We still think digital is definitely the most important way to go, particularly if you have young, younger consumers. But outdoor media is growing in our region, and that's an effective media, and we know that. Now, when we talk about television, radio, then you start talking about, no, that's not necessary. Maybe big TV, of course, but I would probably say a digital first strategy. Also in your shopper marketing, I think a digital first strategy is extremely important. But one last thing, and that's why I talked about brand engagement. Also create a really fun, interesting, engaging brand presence online through your own media pages. That's also something that's very important in our region, following brands on their social media pages.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from Hasan Basri Yüksel. By the way, Hasan, I will let your micro open. You can also join us from lively. And the question is, how will the consumption of luxury goods change in customer segments, especially in apparel products? Is the customer's expectation from the luxury product changing?
Okay, so this is an important question because it's a generational question, and this is why when I talk about, let's focus on the perennials and the aging and the Gen Xers. So when we look at the people talk about the growth of luxury in our region, it's growing because the Gen X population is getting older. They have a lot more money. They're the wealthiest generation, and if you talk about luxury, that's really the generation I'd focus on. We go down a generation to millennials, particularly young ones, and maybe Gen Xers. All of a sudden, you see that, let's say in apparel, actually they're going for the complete opposite. So when I was 25, I cared more about the brand I wore than the 25-year-old of today. But as a Gen Xer myself, I'm taking that with me to luxury. So luxury lifestyle, I think, is today in MENA to a large degree a generational one. Of course, there's a geographic story too, because the Arabian Gulf is also wealthier. So when we talk about luxury, there's a lot more demand in the Arabian Gulf than places like the Levant or North Africa. So I'd keep these two things in mind.
So the regions are different than Arabian Gulf and MENA region and Levant, etc. So we should think about this separation as well.
Definitely. That's why I started with that slide, just to say there are some differences. So we need to be careful.
Okay, thank you very much. So is there any more questions? I don't see in the chat, but I guess not, by the way. So we are in time. And we have almost completed our 1 hour. Then thank you very much for all the support and valuable information, Mohammed. It is really good wrap up and a good experience for us as well. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And we can, by the way, Mohammed is having several studies in the region, like syndicated ones, etc. So if you need, you have any questions popping in your mind afterwards, you can reach us. and we can support you with all the information and perhaps available studies as well. Okay.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. And then I'm closing the session. Thanks a lot for everybody joining us.